She gets nothing, my cousin declared at the will reading. The whole family agreed, until the lawyer pulled out a USB drive and said, "Actually, she left everything to the one who caught the thief among you." Silence. "She doesn't deserve a penny," my cousin Veronica said it standing up, like a lawyer closing a case in a courtroom drama, one hand braced on the conference table, the other smoothing the front of her green blazer. Every head in the room nodded. My Uncle Robert, my Aunt Sandra, even the cousins who barely knew me, cousins who hadn't visited Grandma in 3, 4, 5 years, somehow had strong opinions about who deserved her money. I sat there with my hands flat on the table, palms down, like I was trying to keep something from floating away. I said nothing, because I had nothing left to prove to people who'd already decided. My name is Cora Whitfield. I'm 33 years old. I work as a dental hygienist in a practice off Route 9, and until 4 months ago, I spent every single Sunday of my adult life driving to my grandmother's yellow house on Larkspur Lane for chicken soup. 15 years of Sundays. Carrots, celery, 1 bay leaf from a jar so old the label had gone soft and translucent. "Soup is love you can reheat," Grandma Dorothy used to say, tapping the wooden spoon against the pot like a conductor's baton. The rest of the family loved her money. I just loved her. And in 11 minutes, in a law office on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee, I was about to find out that loving her had been the smartest, most dangerous thing I'd ever done. I'd been driving to that yellow house every Sunday for 15 years when the first crack appeared. So small I almost stepped right over it. Grandma Dorothy raised me starting when I was 18, after my mother died of an aneurysm in a grocery store parking lot, and my father, who'd never been much more than a name on a birth certificate anyway, stopped returning calls within 6 weeks. Dorothy didn't have to take me in. I wasn't a minor. I was a legal adult with a GED and a duffel bag. But she opened her door, put my mother's photo on the mantle next to my grandfather's, and told me the guest room was mine, for as long as you need it, which I suspect will be longer than you think. She was right. I stayed 2 years before I got my own place, and then I never really left. Not in the ways that counted. She was 78 when it all started. Still sharp enough to do the crossword in pen, still stubborn enough to refuse a cane even after her hips started catching on stairs. She lived alone in the house my grandfather had built additions onto with his own hands. A porch here, a sunroom there, before he died of a heart attack 11 years ago, staring, according to Dorothy, surprised, like the whole thing was rude of his heart to do. I loved her the uncomplicated way you love someone who chose you when they didn't have to. The rest of the family orbited her differently. My Uncle Robert, her son, 61 years old, a man who'd cycled through 3 failed business ventures, a car wash, a vending machine route, a consulting firm that consisted of him and a laptop, and who called his mother mostly when he needed something. My Aunt Sandra, Robert's wife, a woman who volunteered at her church's clothing drive and somehow always managed to keep the nicest donated items for herself before they hit the racks. Their daughter, my cousin Veronica, 29, a real estate agent with a leased BMW and a habit of talking about building generational wealth while sitting in a house that wasn't hers, planning a future that wasn't earned. They visited on holidays, birthdays, if it was a big one. They called Dorothy's home phone. She refused to get a cell phone until she was 76, and even then only because I bribed her with a promise to teach her solitaire on it, mostly around the holidays too, or when Robert needed to borrow money he never paid back. I didn't think much of the imbalance for years. It was just how things were. I showed up, they didn't. I figured that was its own reward, that love wasn't a competition, that Grandma knew the difference between people who came for her and people who came for what she had. I was right about that. I just didn't understand yet how dangerous it would be to be right. The first red flag was small enough that I almost laughed it off. It was a Tuesday in March, 14 months before Grandma died, and she called me, not our usual Sunday, which should have told me something right there, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard. "I fell," she said, "in the kitchen. I'm fine. I caught myself on the counter. But Cora, I was on that floor for almost 20 minutes before I could get up. My stomach dropped like an elevator with a cut cable." I drove over that night with a bag from the pharmacy, bruise cream, a shower stool, one of those emergency pendant alerts she'd refused for years, and I installed 2 security cameras, one in the kitchen, angled to catch the space between the stove and the counter where she'd gone down, one in the front hallway, so she'd never be more than a few feet from a lens if something happened again. I set them up on her account, her email, her password, her cloud storage subscription that I paid for quietly through an auto draft she never noticed. And then, because I'd read enough stories about caregivers who got accused of things, I removed my own access entirely. I didn't want to log in. I didn't want a reason for anyone to ever say I'd been watching her, controlling her, managing her. "It's your privacy," I told her. "Nobody should have eyes in your house except you." She laughed, this dry little huff that meant she thought I was being dramatic. "Who exactly do you think I'm going to show it to? The cat?" She didn't have a cat. That was the joke. I laughed too, and we ate soup, and I drove home thinking I'd solved the problem. I hadn't. I'd just installed the thing that would eventually prove everything. It was May when the gold bracelet went missing. A thin, twisted rope chain her mother had given her in 1961, the kind of piece that wasn't flashy but was irreplaceable, the kind of thing you don't wear anymore, but you know exactly where it lives in your jewelry box. Grandma mentioned it almost casually over soup, the way you'd mention you couldn't find your good scissors. I can't find my mother's bracelet. I know I put it back in the cedar box. I told myself it was nothing. She was 78. People misplace things. I helped her search the cedar box, the dresser drawers, the little dish by the bathroom sink where she sometimes left rings when she washed her hands. We didn't find it. "It'll turn up," I said, and I believed it because the alternative wasn't something I wanted to hold in my head yet. 6 weeks later, the garnet earrings her late sister had given her for her 50th wedding anniversary were gone too. This time my stomach didn't just drop. It curdled. I told myself it was still nothing, that maybe she'd worn them somewhere and lost one, that maybe she'd given them to Sandra for safekeeping and forgotten, the way memory does strange rearranging tricks as we age. I actually called Sandra to ask, my voice as light as I could make it. Hey, random question. Did Grandma ever give you her garnet earrings? She thinks she misplaced them. Sandra's answer came a half-second too fast. No, why would she do that? I had no proof of anything. Just a half-second delay that sat wrong in my chest for days. In August, Grandpa's wedding ring disappeared from the small ceramic tray on Dorothy's nightstand, where it had sat untouched for 11 years since he died. She didn't wear it. She just liked knowing it was there. This time she called me crying. Not the soft tears of forgetfulness, but the sharp, frightened tears of someone realizing something was actually wrong. Someone's in my house, Cora, she said. Someone's taking things. I checked the camera footage that night, hands shaking so badly I had to set the laptop down twice. I scrubbed through 6 weeks of clips. Nothing showed the theft directly. The nightstand was out of frame, a blind spot I hadn't accounted for when I mounted the hallway camera. But I found something almost as bad. Robert's Honda Accord parked in her driveway on a Tuesday afternoon when Dorothy told me later that she'd been at her hair appointment for 2 hours. He hadn't mentioned visiting. Neither had she known he'd come. I called him, tried to keep my voice neutral. Hey, were you at Grandma's Tuesday? She thought maybe you dropped something off. Just checking on her gutters, he said. In and out, 5 minutes. 5 minutes doesn't match 2 hours of parked car, time-stamped on video I never told him existed. I told myself it could still be nothing. Maybe he'd left and come back. Maybe I was starting to see monsters and shadows because I was scared and grieving something that hadn't even happened yet. The slow loss of a woman I loved, piece by piece, item by item. The pearl necklace was the one that broke something in me. It was worth $12,000. Appraised, insured, documented, because my grandfather had saved 11 months of skipped lunches to buy it for their 30th anniversary. Dorothy told that story every single time she wore it. Robert Whitfield ate peanut butter sandwiches for 11 months so I could have real pearls. 11 months, Cora. That's a man who knows what love costs. She noticed it missing on a Sunday in October right before I arrived. I found her standing in front of the open cedar box, her hand pressed flat against her chest like she was holding her own heart in. It was here Thursday, she said. I know it was here Thursday. I did something I'm not proud of admitting scared me more than anything else that year. I sat her down and I asked her, as gently as I knew how, whether she was sure, whether she might have moved it, whether her memory. She looked at me with an expression I'll carry the rest of my life. Not anger, worse, hurt. You think I'm losing my mind? She said. No, I said, too fast, my own eyes burning. No, Grandma, I don't think that. I'm scared. I don't know what else to think. She reached across the cedar box and took my hand. Then find out, she said. Don't manage me. Find out. I tried to confront the family directly. Once, at a birthday dinner for Veronica's daughter in early November, I pulled Sandra aside in the kitchen, away from the noise, and I told her plainly that things were disappearing from Grandma's house and that I was worried. Sandra's face did something I still think about, a flicker, there and gone, like a candle catching a draft. Then it smoothed into something practiced. Maybe, she said, you should look closer to home. I didn't understand what she meant until 3 weeks later when I found out she'd already started saying it to other people, that I had more access than anyone, that it was worth keeping an eye on things, that maybe, I should be the one explaining where Grandma's jewelry had gone. They weren't investigating a theft, they were building a case, and the suspect they'd already chosen was me. By December, Grandma had had enough of losing things quietly. She called a locksmith on her own without telling me, and had every lock in the house rekeyed. Then she did something none of us expected from a woman who'd needed help setting a DVR clock 2 years earlier. She hired a private investigator. His name was Daniel Farrow. 19 years with the county sheriff's department before he went private, specializing, according to his card, in elder financial exploitation and asset recovery. Dorothy found him through her church's elder care coordinator, and she paid his retainer $4,000 out of an account none of us knew existed, a small CD she'd cashed early at a penalty, rather than let anyone see the withdrawal on her main statement. She told me about him only after the fact, in January, over soup, like she was confessing something. I didn't want to worry you, she said, and I didn't want you to talk me out of it. Grandma, I wouldn't have. You would have, she said, not unkindly. You'd have said let's handle it as a family. And Cora, honey, the family is the problem. Farrow pulled the cloud footage, my footage, the account I'd set up and then locked myself out of, which meant Dorothy had spent months quietly teaching herself, at 78, how to log in, scrub through timestamps, and export clips onto a USB drive she kept in a locked box in her closet. She told him, and later told me, that she'd done it alone, one hunt and peck keystroke at a time, some nights until 1 a.m., because she refused to ask anyone for help with a search where she didn't yet know who she could trust. It took Farrow 6 weeks. He cross-referenced the camera timestamps against a pawnshop database. Standard practice, he told Dorothy, for any exploitation case, since most family thieves don't have the patience or connections to fence high-value items through anything but the nearest counter that doesn't ask questions. He found it at Coastal Pawn and Gold on Route 4, 11 miles from Robert's house. A ticket dated the previous November, $12,400 for a strand of pearls, matching the appraisal on file with Dorothy's insurance policy down to the clasp description, signed, dated, photographed, with a driver's license copy stapled to the transaction record. Robert Whitfield's name on every line. Dorothy didn't confront him. Farrow advised strongly against it. Tipping the subject before you have full documentation, he called it, just gives them time to build a defense or destroy evidence. And Dorothy, despite everything, followed his advice like she'd been doing this her whole life instead of discovering it at 79. Instead, she called her lawyer. Gerald Aldridge had been Dorothy's estate attorney for over 20 years, a soft-spoken man in his 60s with reading glasses that lived on a chain around his neck and a habit of cleaning the lenses with a cloth before he said anything important, as though he needed clean glass to see the truth clearly himself. Dorothy went to his office alone in February, 4 months before she died, carrying the USB drive, the pawn ticket, and a folder of camera stills Farrow had printed and labeled by date. She sat right across from me, Aldridge told me much later, and she said, "Gerald, I need you to help me make sure this comes out the right way, and I need you to make sure it comes out at the right time." She rewrote her will that day. Not out of anger, Aldridge insisted, out of clarity. She wanted, she told him, the person who actually came to have what she'd built, and she wanted the people who didn't to understand, in a room, together, exactly why. She also insisted, over Aldridge's gentle pushback, on a cognitive evaluation. "I know what people will say," she told him, "that I wasn't in my right mind. Let's remove that card from the deck before anyone tries to play it." Dr. Priya Nandakumar, a geriatric psychiatrist with 18 years of practice, administered a full neurocognitive assessment 3 days before Dorothy signed the new will. Dorothy scored in the 97th percentile for her age bracket. Dr. Nandakumar's written evaluation, 6 pages, notarized, filed with Aldridge's office, noted no evidence of cognitive impairment, undue confusion, or diminished capacity, and specifically documented that Dorothy articulated her reasoning for estate decisions with clarity, consistency, and independent judgment. She was building a case not just against the thief and her family, but against every argument they might use to unbuild what she'd decided. Quick pause. If you want more stories like this in better quality, my Spotify's linked in the description. I didn't know any of this was happening. I was still driving over every Sunday, still making soup with her, still watching her get quieter, thinner, more tired, and telling myself it was just age catching up the way it does. I didn't know she was dying until she told me herself in March over a bowl of soup neither of us finished. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Diagnosed 6 weeks earlier and told to no one but her oncologist, Dr. Marcus Webb and Gerald Aldridge. "I didn't want the Sundays to change," she said, when I asked why she hadn't told me sooner. "I wanted a few more of them to just be soup." She died 11 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, at home, with a hospice nurse named Renata Castillo beside her, and me holding her hand, having driven over the moment the call came, my own hands shaking too hard to grip the steering wheel properly on the way. She never told me about Farrow, never told me about the camera footage, the pawn ticket, the will. She let me grieve her clean, without the weight of what she'd uncovered, and left the weight, deliberately, carefully, for a room full of people who thought they already knew how the story ended. The funeral was on a Saturday in late April. 200 people came, which surprised no one who'd ever met Dorothy Whitfield, and almost none of them were family in any sense beyond blood. It was at the reception, in the church basement, over sheet cake and lukewarm coffee, that I first heard Sandra say it out loud, to a cluster of her church friends, her voice pitched, just loud enough. "Certain people had more access than others," she said, dabbing at eyes that weren't actually producing tears. "I'm not naming names, but we all know." I stood 12 feet away with a paper plate in my hand, and I felt the floor tilt slightly under me, the specific vertigo of hearing yourself accused in a room full of people nodding along. Robert found a different word for it a week later, over the phone, when I called to ask carefully why I'd been removed from the family group chat that Veronica had created to coordinate things after the funeral. "We're just clearing the air," he said. "Nothing personal, Cora. People need to feel like they can talk freely." Talk freely about what? I wanted to ask. I didn't, because some part of me already suspected the answer and didn't want it confirmed out loud. Not yet. I found out anyway, 3 weeks later, from Dorothy's sister, my great-aunt Margaret, 74, sharp-eyed, the only person in the family who'd ever treated me like an equal instead of an afterthought. We were sitting at her kitchen table, the yellow linoleum kind that hasn't been fashionable since 1985, and she reached into her cardigan pocket and slid her phone across to me without a word. Screenshots. 3 of them, from the group chat I'd been excluded from, forwarded to Margaret by a cousin who'd apparently developed a conscience a few weeks too late. Sandra dated 3 weeks before the funeral, which meant before Dorothy died, while she was still alive, still eating soup with me on Sundays. "We need to get ahead of this. Make sure everyone knows Cora is the one who's been alone with Mom's jewelry." Robert's reply, 4 minutes later. "Agreed. She had access. Nobody else did." Veronica, an hour after that. "Already told 2 people. Handled." I read it twice, then a third time, because my brain kept refusing to process the timestamp, kept insisting there had to be some mistake, some innocent explanation for a family plotting to frame me for theft, while the woman they were supposedly protecting was still alive to hear them do it. If she'd only known. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set the phone down on the table. "They planned it," I said, "before she was even buried." Margaret didn't say anything at first. She just reached across the table and squeezed my hand, the same gesture Dorothy used to make, like it ran in the blood along with the stubbornness. "I should have shown you sooner," she finally said. "I didn't know how." I asked her why she thought they'd do it. "Build a story that specific, that coordinated, aimed at me instead of at each other. Because you're the one who showed up," Margaret said. "And people who don't show up need somebody to blame for what they didn't do." The will reading was scheduled for the second Thursday in May in Gerald Aldridge's office on the 3rd floor of a squat brick building downtown, and I found out about it the way I found out about most family business now, secondhand, through Margaret, since I was still locked out of the group chat that apparently existed to plan around me. I had, by my count, about 18 hours between learning the date and having to sit in that room across from the people who'd already decided what kind of person I was. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed running through everything: the missing bracelet, the earrings, the ring, the necklace, the half-second delay in Sandra's Sandra's voice, the 2-hour gap in Robert's story, the screenshots on Margaret's phone, and I kept landing on the same helpless conclusion. I had suspicions. I had no proof. And the people who did have proof, if it existed at all, were either dead or hadn't told me anything. I called Aldridge's office at 8 a.m., my voice tighter than I meant it to be, and his assistant told me only that the reading was scheduled for 2 p.m. and that Mr. Aldridge has specific instructions for how the meeting will proceed. She wouldn't say more. I spent the morning doing the thing you do when you have no control over an outcome and desperately need the illusion of some. I cleaned my apartment. I reread old texts from Grandma. I found one from 8 months earlier, unremarkable at the time, that I read differently now. Thank you for Sunday. Some people show up because they have to. You show up because you want to. I noticed the difference, even if I don't say it enough. I hadn't understood, reading it back then, that she was already keeping score. Not of who visited more, of who was telling the truth with their actions while other people told lies with their words. By 1:30 p.m., I was sitting in the parking lot of Aldridge's building, hands on the steering wheel, doing the breathing exercises a therapist had taught me 2 years earlier for a panic attack I'd had after my mother's death anniversary. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. I had no idea walking up those stairs that I was about to sit through the longest 20 minutes of my life, and that they would end with the truth exploding across a screen in a way none of us, not even Veronica, with her closing argument certainty, could have predicted. The conference room held 10 people and a laptop connected to a projector nobody had used before, judging by how long it took Aldridge's assistant to get the input source right. Robert sat at the head of the table like he already owned it. Sandra sat beside him, hands folded on top of each other, a posture I now recognized thanks to Margaret's screenshots, as rehearsed innocence. Veronica stood, actually stood, one hand braced on the table. When it came time for her declaration, cream blazer, heels, voice pitched for maximum effect. She doesn't deserve a penny. Nobody argued. Robert nodded along, slow and solemn, like a man agreeing with a eulogy. Sandra folded her hands tighter, like she'd already won something, and was trying not to look too pleased about it. I sat with my palms flat on the table and said nothing, because I'd learned over the last 6 months that defending yourself to people who've already decided your guilt only gives them more material to twist. Gerald Aldridge cleaned his glasses with the small cloth he kept in his breast pocket, unhurried, and reached for a sealed envelope sitting square in the center of the table, like it had been waiting there the whole meeting for its moment. Your mother came to see me 4 months before she passed, he said, to the room generally, though his eyes found mine for half a second longer than anyone else's. She was very specific about how this meeting should proceed. He opened the envelope. Inside, a letter, handwritten, 4 pages, Dorothy's looping cursive unmistakable even from across the table, a USB drive in a small plastic case, a folded receipt, yellowed slightly at the corner, from Coastal Pawn and Gold. Actually, Aldridge said, setting the letter aside for the moment, she left everything to the one who helped her catch the thief in this family. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that has weight that presses against your eardrums. Veronica sat down slowly, her closing argument posture gone in an instant. Aldridge plugged the drive into the laptop. The projector hummed, the lights dimmed at his assistant's touch, and the wall above the credenza filled with a grainy but unmistakable timestamp, 11:47 p.m. The first clip showed Robert in Dorothy's bedroom, moving with the careful, guilty economy of someone who's done something before and knows exactly how long it takes. He opened the cedar box. He lifted out the garnet earrings, held them up to the weak nightlight for a second, like he was checking they were real, and pocketed them. Nobody breathed. The second clip, daytime. Sunlight through the bedroom curtains, Dorothy asleep in her recliner 3 feet away, an afternoon nap she probably hadn't even remembered taking. Veronica, cream blazer visible even in the slightly overexposed footage, lifting the pearl necklace from the same cedar box with 2 fingers, like she was handling something contaminated, and dropping it into her purse in one fluid, practiced motion. That's fake, Veronica said, her voice cracking on the second word. Someone edited that. Nobody answered her. The third clip was already playing. The front hallway camera, daytime. Sandra standing at the open door, waving Robert through with a small, quick gesture, checking over her shoulder twice. A lookout's gesture. Unmistakable once you'd seen the first 2 clips and understood what you were watching. Robert's face went the color of wet paper. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. Aldridge didn't gloat. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply set his glasses back on, picked up Dorothy's letter, and began to read it aloud, his own voice steady in a way that made the whole thing feel more devastating, not less. She'd taught herself to log into the cloud account, he read, sitting in her recliner some nights until 1 in the morning, scrubbing through months of footage alone because she didn't yet know who she could trust with what she was finding. She'd hired a private investigator, 19 years with the sheriff's department, Aldridge noted, reading directly from Farrow's report attached to the file, who'd cross-referenced the footage against pawnshop records within 6 weeks. She'd found the receipt herself in the file Farrow handed her, and sat with it for 3 full days before she could bring herself to show it to anyone. I left it, Aldridge read, and his voice thinned slightly on this line, to the one who came when no one was watching. Not because I was watching to reward her, but because I finally understood that she never once, in 15 years, did anything for me that she thought I'd never find out about. Everyone else in this room can say the opposite. Robert shot to his feet so fast his chair rocked backward and nearly went over. I'll contest this, he said, his voice too loud for the small room. She wasn't in her right mind. Cancer, medication, she scored in the 97th percentile on a full cognitive evaluation 3 days before she signed this document, Aldridge said, flat and immediate, sliding Dr. Nandakumar's 6-page notarized report across the table like he'd been waiting his whole career to produce exactly this document at exactly this moment. Administered by a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist, filed with this office, time-stamped and witnessed. I'd advise against contesting anything until you've read it in full. Sandra started crying then, not the church reception tears, dabbed carefully to avoid ruining mascara, but something rawer, caught, the tears of someone realizing the story they'd told themselves for months had just been proven, on video, in front of everyone, to be exactly backward. Veronica grabbed her purse off the back of her chair and made it almost to the door before she stopped and turned back to look at me. Not with guilt, with fury, the specific, cornered fury of someone who has just understood, one beat too late, exactly who they'd underestimated for years, not because I was weak, but because I'd simply never needed to defend myself with anything louder than showing up. I stood up slowly. My legs felt unfamiliar under me, the way they do after you've been braced for something for so long that your body forgets how to stop bracing even after the danger passes. I picked up the empty cedar box from the center of the table, Dorothy's box, the one Robert and Veronica had emptied piece by piece over 14 months while I installed cameras to protect her, and got accused, in a group chat I wasn't allowed into, of being the one doing the emptying. You can keep the story you told, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. I'll keep the truth she left. Nobody stopped me on my way out. Aldridge's assistant, a young woman named Priya Chen, who I'd later learn was already on the phone with the county's Elder Financial Abuse Unit before I'd even reached the parking lot, gave me a small nod as I passed her desk. Detective Marissa Ould of the county's Elder Financial Exploitation Unit opened a formal investigation within the week, using Farrow's report, the pawnshop receipt, and the video files, now formally logged into evidence with a documented chain of custody, as the foundation. Coastal Pawn and Gold cooperated fully once served with a subpoena, producing the original signed transaction record, Robert's driver's license copy, and surveillance footage from their own counter camera, showing him completing the sale. Robert was charged with grand theft and exploitation of an elder adult, a felony given the value of the pearls alone. He accepted a plea deal 8 months later, restitution of the full appraised value plus interest, 3 years of probation, and a permanent bar from serving as executor or fiduciary on any estate in the state, a detail his own lawyer hadn't warned him would follow him the rest of his life. Sandra was not criminally charged. Detective Ould told me, gently, over the phone, that waving someone through a door sits in a legal gray area that prosecutors are reluctant to pursue without more. But she was named, along with Robert, in a civil restitution judgment Aldridge's office filed on the estate's behalf. She lost her position on the church clothing drive committee within a month, not through any official action, but through the quiet, thorough way small communities process the difference between what's illegal and what's merely unforgivable. Veronica's real estate brokerage, upon learning of the felony charges swirling around her name in a small enough town that the local paper ran 2 paragraphs about it, quietly declined to renew her contract at the end of the quarter. Her BMW lease, I heard through Margaret, went unrenewed too, not by choice. The bracelet and the wedding ring were never recovered. Farrow believes, based on Robert's pattern with the pearls, that they were pawned at a different shop, possibly under a different name, and the trail simply went cold. I've made a kind of peace with that. Some things, once taken, don't come back, no matter how thoroughly the truth eventually does. I inherited the house on Larkspur Lane, Dorothy's modest but carefully managed investment accounts, and this detail still catches in my throat every time I think about it. A letter Aldridge had held back from the reading itself, meant for me alone, that I didn't open until I was sitting on Dorothy's porch swing that same night, the cedar box in my lap. Cora, it read, I know you'll want to give some of this away, to smooth things over, to make the peace you've always tried to keep. Don't. Peace built on pretending isn't peace, it's just a longer wait for the truth to come out anyway. You already know that better than anyone in this family. Make the soup on Sundays, keep the recipe exactly as messy as I wrote it. And Cora, thank you for 15 years of being the only person who never once made me feel like a bank account with a pulse. I still make the soup on Sundays. Carrots, celery, 1 bay leaf, though I finally had to replace the jar. The original one, older than me, finally cracked in the dishwasher last spring, and I cried harder over that than I expected to, standing over the sink with a dish towel pressed to my face. Margaret comes most Sundays now. So does Renata, the hospice nurse who sat with Dorothy at the end, who I stayed in touch with almost by accident and then on purpose. It's a small table these days, smaller than the one at the will reading, but every person sitting at it showed up because they wanted to, not because they were counting on something at the end of it.